Hello, I'm Miranda Kahn.
And I'm John Bachman. Coming up today here on Newsmax Now.
2 years ago today, Boston and our nation were rocked by convicted terrorist Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his brother. But you can't keep Boston down. A look at how the world is honoring that city today.
And from coast to coast, protesters on the streets clashing with police in places like New York and San Francisco. See how and why things got so out of control, and what do these people actually want? And Hillary's campaign is off to sort of an awkward start, and the campaign press corps, well, they just can't seem to figure it out either. We'll break it down with Newsmax.com managing editor Alina Hernandez.
It's 11 a.m. on the East Coast, and this is Newsmax Now.
And we welcome you in. Let's quickly mention the developing story at this hour. Aaron Hernandez, the former player for the Boston Patriots, is now a convicted murderer.
Yes, he's been found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also found him guilty on unlawful weapons and ammunition charges. We'll have much more on this story coming up.
All right, let's move on now. We begin this hour after that breaking news there with the violent protests that we saw playing out on the streets, on American streets yesterday.
Yeah, let's start in New York. Actually, let's start in Massachusetts. That's where, again, we're going to remind everybody there was a verdict reached in the Aaron Hernandez trial. Let's go to New York now, talking about the protesters and the protests going all around the country. Let's go to the Brooklyn Bridge. There you can see it right there. Evening rush. Protesters were blocking traffic. 2 officers were also reportedly hurt. Things also got a little rough in San Francisco. That's where protesters and police got into a bit of a shoving match at City Hall. No arrest reported. About 30 protests were staged all across the country.
And we're now seeing some shocking video of police in Arizona taking down a man who was armed with a high-powered rifle. This is in the Tucson suburb of Mariana in February. You can see it right here. That suspect was hit by a cruiser. He had already fired off one shot. This video was taken from the back of a cruiser. Let's take a listen to that police chief.
The guy's not obeying commands. The guy has a high-powered rifle. The guy has already cranked off one round, and the guy is now very near to heavily populated businesses.
Mariano Valencia, that's the guy you saw in the video. He was the one being hit. He was suspected of a string of crimes and had allegedly stolen that rifle from a local store. As you can imagine, he's facing several felony charges today.
Well, very different views today on the move by President Obama to pull Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Across Cuba, the decision's being cheered. Cubans had called it an insult to their national pride, but ask Cuban Americans in Florida, and you'll get a much different reaction.
Obama, I think, is a sympathizer of the communist regimes of Cuba and of the enemies of the United States.
And in Washington, Republican lawmakers are blasting that move. House Speaker John Boehner says it's just one more example of the president focusing more on befriending our enemies than helping our allies. Congress is going to get the power to review a nuclear deal with Iran. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday unanimously passed the bill, and the White House has lifted that threat of a veto. It's expected now to pass in the full Senate and the House. Under the measure, Congress will have a month to review any deal. During that review, the president will be blocked from lifting sanctions against Iran. The European Union hits Google with antitrust allegations.
Google's favorable treatment of its comparison shopping service, you probably know it as Google Shopping, is an abuse of Google's dominant position in general search.
Google handles 90% of all internet searches in Europe right now. Leaders there say they've tried to reach a settlement with the company, but so far have failed. The legal wrangling could go on for years and could also cost Google billions of dollars in fines.
And flags around the country are flying at half-staff today, marking the 150th anniversary since the death of Abraham Lincoln. Yesterday at Ford's Theater in Washington, reenactors paid their own tribute on the anniversary, again, of his shooting by John Wilkes Booth.
Well, for everybody else, it's been, probably a long 2 years. For us, it seems as though it's, just yesterday.
All right, there is Boston Marathon survivor Liz Norden. Her 2 sons were injured in the twin blast, of course, that rocked the finish line. Boston marking the somber anniversary this morning, 2 years since the marathon bombing that killed 3 people. A 4th police officer, 4th victim of that, was killed afterwards. Also, 264 people injured as well.
Mayor Martin Walsh is marking the day with a ceremony at the site where the bombs went off.
And Marina, I think this is one of those days like 9/11 where we all remember where we were when we first heard the news. We were actually just getting started in the concepts for Newsmax TV, and this was the first event we ever covered live on the web.
Wow. Can't believe it's been that long. It seems just like the other day.
And then being in the media, of course, the 48 hours following that coverage, everyone was on high alert, and we remember that shelter-in-place notice that a lot of those residents got, the police going door-to-door searching houses. And this was an ER nurse speaking about the immediate aftermath of those bomb blasts.
These patients were terrified. They were screaming, they were crying, they were asking us questions. What happened? Was it a bomb? Are people coming out to get us? And we honestly ourselves, we had to just fight back our own fears and just hold their hands while we were wrapping their legs to go to the OR, hold their hands while we're putting IVs in and starting blood on them, and just try to reassure them that, we don't know what happened, but you're here, you're safe with us.
And it's just so captivating to hear those stories of all these survivors. And the way I remember watching the video, there was that moment of shock after the blast went off. But the way the folks like those nurses and others, heroes, went into action to help the victims of this. We also have another soundbite from a marathon survivor. Let's take a listen to that.
I saw the huge white smoke, and then I heard people screaming. Then the crowd started running different directions. And then after a couple of seconds, I heard the second explosion.
You know what when I think back at that day is just seeing how chaotic it was when those blasts went off, seeing those runners, people not really knowing what was going on, and then right there, you see it.
Yeah, and then watching the trial.
That's the image that's kind of stuck in my mind.
Of course, we just had this trial play out in Boston. You could feel the emotion of the city play out through that trial. And, again, we're seeing the surveillance video there, and that little circle is showing us where Johar Tsarnaev was. You see him in that white hat. And the additional surveillance video, Miranda, like this, but that came out during the trial, also shocking. And then we learned about what he did in those few moments before he was actually on the run for police. And when you hear about that information, it's of little wonder why he was convicted on all counts. I think there was 30 of them that he faced, and could still likely face the death penalty when they get started with that. Of course, President Obama promised justice after the Boston Marathon bombing. Let's take a listen to the president.
We still do not know who did this or why, and people shouldn't jump to conclusions before we have all the facts. But make no mistake, we will get to the bottom of this, and we will find out who did this. We'll find out why they did this. Any responsible individuals, any responsible groups will feel the full weight of justice.
And so, to some degree, we have seen that play out. The guilty verdict for Johar Tsarnaev. And of course, that was the president immediately after responding to the incident. But his brother, Tamerlan, we know that he also went over to Southwest Asia, and he studied and worked with terrorists there. And so there's still this concern we have now coming up about these people with U.S. passports being able to travel overseas and getting to this training. That what really separated this one from some of these other lone wolf incidents where he actually had training in overseas. Right, and on America's Forum earlier today, we were actually talking about how some of these terrorist cells are as close as 8 miles away from the Texas border. So scary stuff. Disturbing, to say the least. Well, make sure you join us on this Friday. We'll have criminal defense attorney Jeffrey Nathan joining us to talk about the Tsarnaev penalty phase. Will he get the death penalty? And some folks say maybe it's a little too soon after the anniversary. Of course, the marathon will be this Monday, so that'll be a poignant moment as well. And we continue here on Newsmax Now. An uphill battle for Mrs. Clinton. Has the media had enough of the former First Lady? Also, Hillary Clinton trying to be an every woman and appeal to voters, but as the media frenzy builds around her campaign, it appears the facade may be slipping. You're watching Newsmax Now.